It is 3 p.m. in Prague on a cold January 17th, 1969. City residents peer outside their windows, overlooking Wenceslas Square, where they witness a fellow citizen douse himself in petrol, light a match, and become engulfed in fire. Jan Pollock was a student activist at Charles University who self-immolated in protest against the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia and authoritarian rule that the nation had suffered for over 2 decades. In his manifesto, titled Torch Number 1, he wrote, "As our nations find themselves on the brink of hopelessness and surrender, we have decided to express our protest and awaken the nation's conscience. If people do not come forward with sufficient support for our demands, more torches will be lit." But what did it mean for Czechoslovakia to regain this sort of consciousness that Pollock wrote about? And does fighting without physical force, or soft power, have any impact, or is brute strength the only way to change the course of history? When we reach back, we find that, by applying their liberal arts skills, Czechoslovak citizens fulfilled their responsibility to speak out against an oppressive government, stoked the fire of protest throughout their country, rekindled the embers of resistance throughout 2 decades of Soviet occupation, and spread the light of consciousness throughout their borders and beyond. As a result, Czechoslovaks were able to seize their rights without the use of physical weapons.
But first, let's rewind. In 1948, the Soviet Union first established authoritarian control over Czechoslovakia by helping the Czechoslovak Communist Party, also known as the KSC, to stage a coup d'etat and assume undisputed reign over parliament. In September of 1953, Antonin Novotny was elected as first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. As a committed Stalinist, he focused his party's attention on limiting the free press, which, from his perspective, served as a possible threat to his claim to absolute power. Lighting the match. From 1966 to 67, protesters within the intellectual community, students, writers, and artists, illuminated Novotny's abuses, raised citizens' consciousness, and ultimately disempowered him, not with arms, but with verbal expression. In 1966, a traditional student festival, Mahales, was turned into a demonstration protesting the restrictions on their freedoms under Novotny. A year later, the younger generation led protests, calling for, quote, more light, in response to the declining condition of student life. The Communist Party responded to their peaceful calls with violence, sending police to brutalize them into stopping the protest. That same year, Czechoslovak writers in a Congress meeting renounced the KSC censorship over free speech. After Novotny's downfall, the party turned to a new leader, one with optimism and conviction, a new hope for the KSC. Alexander Dubček. Running with the slogan, Socialism with a Human Face, Dubček sought to legitimize the power of the KSC. In office, Dubček implemented the Action Program, which would expand the rights of citizens. The plan called for a new constitution, through which there would be freedom of speech, religion, the press, assembly, travel, and art. This transition to a more politically and economically free state is what would later become known as Prague Spring. Through the Action Program, Dubček redefined the Communist Party's responsibilities towards its citizens by prioritizing basic human rights over total power, making way for a new age of activism.
Stoking the flame. During Prague Spring, activists applied a broader range of liberal arts tools, paintings, music, poetry, novels, and plays to fight oppressive government practices. Having been given enough free speech rights by Dubček to openly criticize the government, the citizens realized that if they wanted more rights, it was their responsibility to push for them. The national press was finally able to expose the corruption of Novotny and other government officials close to him. Interest groups were allowed to form more freely, such as the K231, a group of former political prisoners who coalesced to seek justice by demanding legal, civil, and social rehabilitation. Czech artists rejected optimistic ideas about Soviet life that were depicted under the art genre of Soviet realism, which was highly encouraged by the government of the time. Instead, they took after a more imaginative form that explored the landscapes of the psyche. Playwright Václav Havel used several of his works, such as The Memorandum or The Garden Party, to satirically criticize the bureaucracy and conformity that were supported by the USSR. Other forms of resistance included Prague's underground culture of music. A new generation of Czech musicians, such as the 1968 rock band Plastic People of the Universe, opposed authoritarianism with song. In fact, the group was so influential that its members were eventually convicted of, quote, disturbing the peace within the communist regime. But rock music wasn't the only thing being targeted by the Soviet Union. The regime loomed over Prague, fearful that it would lose its grip over the whole country and possibly the rest of the Eastern Bloc. Finally, on August 20th, 1968, the Soviet Union decided that they had seen enough, and early that morning, Prague was invaded by over 600,000 Warsaw Pact troops. Although there was resistance to the invasion in the form of protests, the troops prevailed, and it seemed as though soft power could never triumph against physical strength. The Soviet government had the perspective that it was their responsibility to maintain communism in the Eastern Bloc by all means necessary. Dubček was arrested and flown back to Moscow for negotiations. When he finally returned to Prague on August 27th, he tearfully addressed his country. "We hope that you will trust us even though we might be forced to take some temporary measures that limit democracy and the freedom of opinion." As time went on, Dubček's reforms were reversed under a period called normalization. During that time, the communist regime replaced Dubček with Stalinist Gustav Husak, who reinstated the authoritarian regime that Dubček had fought just a few months earlier.
Czechoslovakia would remain under an oppressive regime for the next 2 decades, at least temporarily validating the perspective that soft power was insufficient in the face of hard power. Still, citizens were able to maintain their ideas of freedom, rekindling the embers. Although the risks of battling oppressive practices had significantly increased, artists and intellectuals inspired a resurgence of activist spirit, and eventually, the embers they ignited grew so pervasively that Soviet efforts to extinguish it only spread the fire further. In January of 1969, Jan Pollock and his followers lit themselves on fire in protest of the new and oppressive violations of their rights. Urging the nation to overcome its collective state of disillusionment, Pollock's sacrifice was, in essence, a piece of performance art, and it delivered the clear message that activism in Czechoslovakia didn't end with Prague Spring. Following his death, there was an outcry in the intellectual community for change. People took to writing manifestos, letters, and petitions to express their demands for the government. For example, the Charter 77 petition, co-authored in 1977 by Václav Havel, criticized both the communist Czech government and the Soviet Union for their suppression of progressive expression. Within a week after the document was written, prominent newspapers in the West published the full text, which circulated through the Warsaw Pact countries and the rest of Europe. Other writers took a different approach by distributing samizdat, underground texts including fiction, political works, and philosophical essays throughout the 1980s. And with that, they passed down their messages of freedom to the next generation.
They showed that it's the non-violent character of the protest that ultimately will overthrow an illegitimate, evil government.
Throughout 1989, students led mass, peaceful demonstrations in a movement that would later be known as the Velvet Revolution. Their call for a government that valued diverse opinions heavily influenced the Eastern European protests that eventually led to the collapse of the USSR, and with it, a harmful censorship over free speech. In 1990, the Czechs cast their first ballots for a democratically elected president in half a century. In fact, their new leader was none other than Václav Havel himself, the same writer who used his work as activism in earlier decades, solidifying the impact that his art had on the nation.
Many often attribute the Soviet Union's fall to economic failure and military overspending, but the deeper truth is that the regime couldn't bear the cost of silencing a people who knew their rights and embraced their responsibility to defend them. Although Dubček's reforms did not prevail in the short term, the spirit of creative defiance which was sparked during Prague Spring made it so that no amount of force could crush the movement in the long run. As Americans, we live in an age when investment in the liberal arts is being neglected in favor of STEM. However, the events that unfolded during and after Prague Spring teach us the long-term lesson that the pen can be mightier than the sword, that a collective responsibility calls on every citizen to stand against oppression, and that the right to speak out cannot be suppressed. As President Biden said in his farewell address, we choose whether we lead by the example of our power or by the power of our example, and whether we show the courage to stand up to the abuse of power or whether we yield to it. May we all be the keeper of the flame.
Right here, right now, what you